Thank you, Remy, and thanks to all the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak here. I'm also looking forward to the other presentation of this workshop. I will talk about biophysical land use climate interactions in low emission scenario. And I would like to acknowledge several collaborators on the recent papers related to this topic. So I wanted to start with this figure, which is showing what are the effects of vegetation on the climate. And obviously this includes also several biophysical effects. So we tend to focus on the carbon effects, but the biophysical effects include effects on the energy fluxes, for instance, through albedo, and also effects on the water cycle through evapotranspiration. I have some problem with, yeah, so I'm just highlighting here the biophysical effects. This figure was also shown by Remy. So this is an overview of different approaches that are considered to do carbon dioxide removal. And some of those approaches rely strongly on the changes in the land cover or land use, which include, for instance, bioenergy use, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or forestation. This is particularly important in low emission scenarios because we are basically already too late in the sense that we have emitted too much CO2. So all of the scenarios, this was also mentioned by Remy, all of the scenarios that are reaching 1.5 degree, which are stabilizing warming to 1.5 degree, include at least some carbon dioxide removal. The order is about 10% of present day emissions. There are a number of issues which I will talk about. One topic, which is the main topic here, is the fact that biophysical feedbacks are not integrated. So the way these effects of land use, land coverages are integrated is that the main purpose is to affect the carbon cycle, but the possible effect on biophysics, or for instance, in terms of modifying temperature or precipitation, are not considered. And I think that's a point I really want to highlight. I think this is a really important point as well, is obviously what we are starting to say, that we might want to modify climate with major changes in land cover or land use, be it through carbon cycle effects, also biophysical effects. We should ask ourselves whether those projected land use changes are resilient to climate change. For instance, if we have major changes in climate extremes, fires, and so on. So two papers what we have done in our group are mostly looking at this effect, the biophysical effects of land use, land cover changes in the context of low emission scenario. There is a study here led by Annette Hirsch and Benoit Guillot, which was based on an experiment we called Happy Land, to which 3 different groups contributed with climate simulations. And we were using one IM scenario from that left-hand front from the image model. Then we have also written with some colleagues a short paper, which was providing an overview of projected changes in climate extremes at 1.5 degree, and also including an overview of changes in land cover in the emission scenarios that are considered compatible with 1.5 degree. So what are the possible effects, the biophysical effects of land use changes? And in terms of their link to CO2 exchange, well, in some cases, you could have substantial co-benefits. One example is no-till farming, where you could have a cooling from the change in albedo, which in addition, which could add up to possible capture of CO2, or at least less loss of carbon, although this is open. But you also could have substantial trade-off, for instance, with afforestation. If you plant trees in regions where you have a snow cover, this actually leads to a warming, so you would have actually counteracting effects on the climate. So in terms of the albedo changes, Edouard is also giving a presentation, so I will keep this short, but this was a study led by Edouard Davin, and Philippe was also a co-author on it. And the idea was to look at the impact of no-till farming for climate, but in terms of biophysical feedbacks. What this was looking at was the effects of albedo and evaporation. And what we found was that there was a preferential cooling of hot extremes, both from the albedo and evaporation effect. In terms of albedo, the interesting part is that when you have hot days, you tend to have more radiation, which is why the change in albedo is actually to have a stronger effect on the energy budget than in normal days. And that's why you have basically more cooling here at this tail of the distribution. And actually, even for evaporation, you have asymmetric responses because you are saving some water, which in normal days tend actually to lead to a warming because you're evaporating less water. But in very hot days, you have more water available, which leads to a cooling. So the two effects together lead to this asymmetric response, which means we have a particularly strong cooling of extreme hot days compared to the mean. That's the median response here, that's the tail of distribution. And so this is showing that it's also important to have this focus on extreme effects and not only mean response, because the response of extreme events might be different than the response of the mean climate. Another effect that is relevant, this is not directly related to albedo, but it's definitely relevant when you're looking at impacts of land use change on the climate, is the irrigation. This is from a study led by Wim Thierry, in which we looked at impact of present-day irrigation on climate. And again, we were looking both at effects on mean climate and on extremes. And there again, we find a stronger cooling for extremes. So there is a general cooling because when you have evaporation, some of the energy is then used for latent heat flux instead of heating the air. But this cooling is again much larger for the hot days because there you have a stronger net effect on the temperature. And interestingly, these effects is what we assess from climate model simulations. This effect is what we expect to have in present day, but they are generally not included in climate model simulations. Another effect is direct effect of afforestation or deforestation on albedo and temperature, also through evaporation. Edouard is going to speak more about this topic, but the study led by Quentin Lejeune, we found that the historical deforestation locally increased the intensity of hot days in the northern mid-latitude. So we find that there's already had some impact on changes in hot days, for instance, of change in forest cover. So what are the land cover changes that we expect in low emission scenarios? And I think one first point is that some of those changes could be substantial. And the other important point is that integrated assessment models show really substantial differences in those scenarios. So what I'm showing here are projected changes in forest cover in 4 typical integrated assessment models: the GCAM model, image model, message globiome, and remind MACPI. And you see actually the change in forests for 2 scenarios compatible with 1.5 degree. One is associated with SSP1 scenario. So in terms of socioeconomic aspect, it's a more sustainable scenario. And the other one is SSP2, which is less sustainable. And interestingly, you do have substantial changes in land cover. So for instance, in this SSP1 scenario, GCAM has massive afforestation in a large part of the world. So you see, you have strong afforestation in Europe and actually also in many of those regions, in the high latitude regions, where it could locally lead to the warming and also very extensive afforestation here in South America and Africa. The other IAMs show a bit less afforestation. Actually, some show very little afforestation. So that's showing that there is some type of range in how this could be implemented according to the IAM models. And the other point is also considering different socioeconomic pathways with less or more sustainability. You could have substantial differences. So for instance, in the case of the image model, you see that the more sustainable pathway includes a lot of afforestation, also because there is a bit less demand for land use due to change in diet. On the other hand, scenario SSP2 here includes a decrease in forests and rather an increase in agriculture. So the main take-home message is it's still quite uncertain how those scenarios could look like. And basically, we need to definitely assess this in more detail. So we had done this study led by Anatesh and Benoit Guillot, in which we wanted to compare what is the direct biophysical effect of those slight modifications and IAM scenarios versus a difference of 0.5 degree in global warming. This analysis here is for the CSM model, and you see here the difference in the temperature of the hottest day, TXX, in basically a 2 degree and a 1.5 degree scenario for both socioeconomic pathways. So you obviously see substantial increase in temperature extremes here. Now here we see the impact of changing the socioeconomic pathway, which, as we have seen before, means in the image model, it means definitely very strong differences in forest cover. And in this model, we found that these different scenarios of forest cover led to substantial differences in temperature, which were of the same order as effects of 0.5 degree of global warming. Now, I should say that the model has some deficiencies in representing those feedbacks, but the point is there are uncertainties remaining, and we find that those effects could be substantial. So here I'm showing the differences, again, of temperature of a yearly hot days now actually in 4 models. So we have the CSM and then these relational models, ADAMS3P, MIROC, and MPI ESM. Again, here you see the impact of 0.5 degree of global warming for the hot extremes. And below, that's the effect of the differences in socioeconomic pathways, so difference in forest cover, depending on the climate model. And there you see obviously that there are also strong differences between the responses simulated by different climate models. So what we need to assess definitely is the respective contribution of those IAM choices, because there we have different possible scenarios for land cover changes, the SSP changes according to those IAMs, and also the climate model choice for the projections. So why is land use change so relevant for regional changes in temperature extreme? Can we understand this? And this is related to a lot of analysis we also have done in our group. The first point is that on regional scale, we tend to see more response than what we see in the mean and global scale. So the first effect is that land tends to warm more than the mean average temperature, because land is warming more than ocean. Plus, regionally, you can have some additional warming, for instance, due to soil moisture feedback. So in regions where you have a drying of the soil, this leads to an additional warming. So this is one example for the Mediterranean region. You see the change in the warmest day of the year. That's from all of the CMIP5 simulations. The lines are for the multimodal mean in the RCP 8.5 and RCP 4.5 scenarios. And you see that we have a more or less a linear response, so we can quantify this, but definitely it's larger than the global mean temperature increase if the temperature in this region for those extremes were too warm, like the global mean temperature, we would be on this black line. So we have this additional warming. So much of this additional warming we see, so this departure between this red line here and the black line is due to land processes and projected drying. And for instance, we have quantified this in this study led by Marta Vogel. So in a further study also led by Annette Hirsch, we looked at what would be the impact of really modifying albedo and also irrigation on larger scale over crop areas for those projected changes in temperature extremes. So this is a similar display as before, but the difference is we see here the CO2 concentrations. And here you have the change in global mean temperature. Here we are looking at Central North America. We have similar results for Central Europe. And you have the change in the hot extremes here with the black line. So again, this stronger warming regionally, actually in that region is particularly strong. And we have then the additional scenarios which were computed with CSM, the CSM model. One scenario in which we increase albedo by 0.1 over all crop areas. And you see this substantial decrease in the regional response of hot extremes, the red line. We had another simulation where we included irrigation over all of the crop area. We have actually similar cooling as from the change in albedo by 0.1. And then we also had simulation where we combine the two effects, that's the green line. So what is clear from this analysis is, yes, having those modifications in land use on very large scale could substantially affect projected changes in temperature. Let's say you take a scenario at which we have a 2 degree of global warming. We see that regionally in this region, and it's similar, for instance, for Central Europe, we have about almost 4 degrees of changes in the hot extremes. But now, if we include an increase in albedo or irrigation, we can decrease the temperature regionally according to simulation by more than 1 degree. And actually, if we combine the two effects, we almost reduce temperature by about 2 degrees. So we actually remove most of this additional amplification of hot extremes. We are back on the response of the global mean temperature. So at 2 degrees, we would have then a 2 degree response regionally. Now, there are a few caveats. Those simulations are conceptual and idealized. We really have massive changes in albedo and irrigation over all of the crop areas. We could ask ourselves whether this is possible on such large scale. But certainly the take-home message is that we have a very strong effect of land use changes on hot extremes, and that those effects are particularly important for low emission scenarios. So what you see in terms of the lines here is they are more or less parallel. So the net effect, let's say you take the combined effect of irrigation and albedo, we have seen before it's about 2 degrees. Well, it's getting a bit higher for higher emission scenario, but still in the relative terms, the effect is stronger for low emission scenario, which means that certainly those biophysical effects are more relevant when we now focus on low emission scenarios, such as those stabilizing temperature at 1.5 degree or 2 degree. But those biophysical feedbacks are not included in integrated assessment models, since they are only considering CO2 effects of the changes in land use or land cover. So the next point, as was also mentioned in introduction from Amy, if land albedo and other biophysical land use effects are so effective, could we, maybe there might be the temptation to consider them to intentionally modify climate. And you could call this, for instance, climate effective land management or land radiative management. And we have also done studies on this topic. So in this perspective paper in Nature Geoscience, we looked at what would be the potential effect of changing albedo over land areas, and possibly to improve adaptation and even mitigation. So the idea is to consider the effects of albedo. We didn't include irrigation, as we have seen before. The effect of irrigation could be as large as those from albedo. So we just wanted to quantify and assess what are the possible changes in albedo that could take place over land. And here is a table from the paper where we summarize those effects. So the different approach that could be considered from our assessment is that you could, for instance, have no-till farming, as we have seen before. So in this case, you have albedo changes from retaining crop residues. And we assess the effect is about 0.05 to 0.2. It depends on the reflectivity of the residues. Then you could also have some effects from crop phenology and the timing of practice. There have been also substantial literature on geoengineering, so what is called biogeoengineering. The idea is there to select specific crops which are more reflective and which could then increase albedo from this. And the net effects could be approximately from 0.02 to 0.15. Greenhouses could also affect albedo. The effects there would be about 0.05 to 0.15. And finally, this is more in a small scale, but could have locally a strong effect, is changes in urban albedo, for instance, from having white roofs or higher reflectivity of paving. And the effects there is approximately from 0.1 to 0.15. And locally, you could have even larger effects up to 0.25. So we did, again, there are very idealized simulations just to look at what would be maybe the highest potential effect of just such modifications. And we did 2 types of experiments. So we did experiments where we changed albedo first over a large domain globally, where we have either high density of population or high crop density, which means that these are regions where we expect we could intentionally modify albedo. And then we also had single experiments where we only modified the albedo regionally. So for instance, only on North America, only Europe or Asia. And we looked at those regional simulations as well. So it was still global simulation, but with regional forcing. So what we found was if you do change the albedo by 0.1 over this large area, it certainly definitely cools down hot extremes in the simulations. And again, like we'd seen in the other analysis, we find a strong gap. We find that the net effect on climate also more regionally constrained. You see mean temperature here in the model is mostly modified over North America. On hot extremes, you do find some non-local effects, but still they are mostly limited. And for instance, we don't find a negative effect on precipitation. So of course, these are again conceptual experiments. We could ask ourselves, is that realistic? I would say my take on this is because there's been substantial literature on solar radiation modification, for instance, by using sulfate aerosol injections. I would consider this more realistic to some extent than thinking about sulfate aerosol injection. I will show a table where we compare the two. But obviously, there are many limitations and concerns. It certainly is no mitigation, and there is also the risk of moral hazards that if we present this type of approach, this might actually slow down mitigation. So as mentioned, we had a table in the paper where we were comparing the effects of this land relative management versus solar radiation management or modification in terms of negative or positive aspects. So the main positive effect from maybe focusing more on albedo on land is that you can have a bit more management on what is happening regionally. So you don't have just a global modification of the solar energy balance. But there are also a number of environmental side effects. So for instance, if you start to use crop areas to modify climate, you might have trade-off with demands from agriculture. There are other aspects in which you could say maybe the land-based approach are a bit better tested. So if you just know some crops are more reflective or no-till farming is leading to more reflections, this shouldn't be a big issue because there is such implementation already exists. In terms of the moral hazard, definitely is a large issue for solar radiation modification on large scale. It's probably less of an issue here with land albedo because we are speaking of a much smaller effect. So the net effect, for instance, on global warming is limited. Nonetheless, I think I would certainly not sell this as a global solution to climate change. So we need to be very careful. It's more of a thought experiment and maybe an overview of what can be do or considered in terms of potential cooling from land use or land cover change. So I come to the next point, which is a widespread modification of land use or land cover to modify climate a safe bet. And I think there I want to go back to both biophysical effects and the carbon cycle effects. So as mentioned, the low emission scenario include massive changes in land cover, in part and mostly actually to decrease CO2 from the air, so to capture some CO2. And again, we could say we could consider biophysical effects also in this context to modify some of the regional response, for instance, by decreasing temperature extremes. And of course, this approach have also received a lot of attention worldwide. For instance, there's the so-called Trillion Tree project, which received a lot of attention. I would say again, there we should be very careful that these are not shown as an alternative to mitigation. So I would be very careful, for instance, when you see that Donald Trump actually was supporting this approach, maybe we should be concerned about what are the implications. So my main concern here is really whether the afforestation on large scale or changes in land use on large scale would be resilient to climate change. And I think that's actually one aspect we really need to look into. So it's not that a tree is not going to capture CO2 or that if we can correctly assess potential impacts on biophysics, we couldn't do this correctly. But I think there are aspects that are independent of our control. So let's say that we plant trees over very large areas, as we have seen in some of the integrated assessment models, either for just afforestation, also, for instance, for BECCS or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. We should ask ourselves whether this large storage of CO2 that we are creating, this large carbon storage, are resilient. For instance, if we have extreme events which leads to forest mortality, obviously those stocks are going to be lost very quickly. And I think we have seen several major fire events, for instance, this year, which suggest that there is some risk there. And so extreme events are not really included in the development of integrated assessment models. And so to some extent, these scenarios with massive changes in land cover could be too optimistic. So I want to finish with this point and mention a project we are starting in our group. It's a small project, an ERC Proof-of-Concept project that is following up on our consolidated grant before, and it's called MESMER-X. And the idea here is to develop an Earth system model emulator, which can emulate Earth system models so that we can have a direct feedbacks in integrated assessment models, so that integrated assessment models are computing different changes in, for instance, land use and land coverages, and then changes in CO2 concentration, but that we can directly include the feedback from climate and then feed these possible effects then in the integrated assessment models to assess whether, for instance, simulated changes in land cover are reasonable or could sustain those changes in climate. So we have already an ESM emulator we have developed. That's work led by Leah Boysch in our group. And we have developed the MESMER emulator, which is an emulator for regional temperature. So given the global temperature trajectory, which can come from a given Earth system model or from a global temperature emulator like MAGIC, we can then compute realistic realization on regional scale. So just to show how this look like, so it looks pretty reasonable. So one of those animations is from an Earth system model, and the others are from the emulator, which is calibrated according to this Earth system model. So we can calibrate the emulator for specific Earth system models, or also for full ensembles like CMIP5 or CMIP6. And in terms of the biophysical effects from land use or land cover change in integrated assessment model, another project that is led by Karl Schlossner and Contalogen at Calamite Analytics is developing also an emulator that would represent specifically these biophysical feedbacks. So in the end, we could have a possible small infrastructure in which the integrated assessment models could have a direct feedback to climate, including the effects of changes in CO2 and changes in biophysical feedbacks. So I come to the conclusions and outlook. Biophysical effects of land use changes, such as albedo, irrigation, and land cover type, are of strong relevance for temperature extremes. And this is in particular the case for low emission scenarios, for instance, when you are stabilizing temperature at 1.5 degree or 2 degree. Low emission scenarios include major changes in land use, particularly related to bioenergy use, to bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, or afforestation. Biophysical effects are not included in integrated assessment models, but it could affect possibly the identification of optimal pathways. Maybe some choices in terms of land cover change could be more beneficial for regional changes in climate and others, given this assessment. Finally, and this is to me really important, the resilience of land cover changes to extreme need to be carefully quantified. And a suggestion and a point on which I want to now dedicate some time is this development of an integrated assessment model and ESM emulator interface. Thank you for the attention.